I want to tell you some stories tonight. So I'm not standing behind the pulpit. I didn't want you to get confused with what Bishop Johnson and I are going to do. I mean, he did one thing, I'm going to do something different. But I wanted to tell you some stories that I have run across. As Peter said, I grew up on Signal Mountain in Chattanooga. And I went to school at Emory Henry in the southwestern Virginia mountains. And then I went to seminary at Emory University at Candler School of Theology. And while at Candler, my superintendent called me in the middle of the year. Now, we Methodists, we only move in June. You know, that's when we do it. And all the pastors, that's when, if we're going to switch anybody, that's when it happens. This was a phone call in January. And he said, Charles, I've got to have somebody to fill in. If you and Janice won't mind driving up on Friday night from Atlanta, you serve this church on the weekends, and then you go back home Sunday night after church. And if you'll just do it for 6 months, we'll put a full-time person there, and you know, you'll just finish up your seminary then. Yes, sir, I'll be glad to. Well, June came, January to June. He moved. And I stayed 6 more years. So, to show you how our system works sometimes. But the appointment I received was on Lookout Mountain, down below Chattanooga, in Dade County, in a community called Plum Nelly. And you Chattanoogans know about Plum Nelly. Plum Nelly is called that because it's in Dade County. It's in northwest Georgia. If you go west, you're in Alabama. If you go north, you're in Tennessee. So it's called Plum Nelly because it's Plum out of Tennessee and Nelly out of Georgia. And we lived in Plum Nelly for 6 wonderful years. Both of our girls were born while we lived at Plum Nelly. Now, it was close to Chattanooga in miles. Culturally, it was not anywhere near where Janice and I grew up in Chattanooga. Even though I was up on the mountain, we were basically city kids, and Plum Nelly was not the city. And so we had to learn how to live in Plum Nelly. For instance, first year people came up to me and said, "Are you going to put a garden in?" And my first thought was, why? You know, just about anything I wanted to eat, I could harvest with a wire basket down at Kroger's. And so I just didn't see a need. But the question persisted long enough that I realized that wasn't the question. The question wasn't, are you going to put a garden in? The question was, when are you going to put a garden in? And once I realized that, I got somebody to come help me. We plowed all that annoying grass I'd been wasting my time mowing. And there it was, right in our backyard, a garden. And we planted, you know, garden things, corn, green beans, okra, garden things. I learned 2 very important lessons that first summer. Weeding is important. You know, you don't weed, you'll grow a lot of stuff, you just won't eat any of it. And the second thing is, there is no human family large enough to consume 7 hills of zucchini. It is the kudzu of the vegetable world and just will take over. We would drive up into Chattanooga to visit our families, and we would pull in the driveway, and you would see them shutting the drapes saying, "Be real quiet, you know, they got more zucchini to give us, and if we just be still, they'll leave." I heard a saying at Plum Nelly. It was, "How do you know when a man has no friends?" And the answer is, he's buying zucchini. Roy Moore called me one day and he said, "Preacher, do you want to go fox hunting?" I said, "Yes." I'd never been fox hunting, but it just sounded like something I needed to do. "Yes." He said, "I'll be by this evening to get you." Okay, right there, guys. City evening and country evening are 2 different times a day. City evening, about now. Country evening, 3:45, 4 o'clock, somewhere in there. So I wasn't even ready when he showed up. Blew his horn out there in the drive, and I went out. He had this Ford pickup, beat up on one side, mashed in on another, rusted through, dogs in a box in the back. Well, we drive through the community. Now, I'm new here. He's helping me learn. He says, "Now over in here," he says, "this is where the Bradfords all live." We drove a little farther. He says, "Now them Bradfords, they married into the McCagues. They live over in here. The McCagues, a lot of them married into the Grays. That's over in here." Drove a little farther, and he said, now a lot of them Grays, they married into my family, the Moores. We lived over this way. And a lot of us, we married into the Bradfords, back up the other way. So right there, you knew, don't talk about anybody, because they were hooked together one way or another. Well, we got over to the bluff. Above Johnson's Crook, it got a view down into Alabama toward Fort Payne. I said, Roy, what's this place called? He said, Looking Off Place. I said, yeah, this Looking Off Place, what's it called? He said, it's called the Looking Off Place. Got it. So we went over to his place and just went out there was no road, there was no path. We're just driving through the field. And we get up on a little knoll. He says, get out. So I got out. We're standing there, and he says, now, preacher, you see that little hollow right down in there? He says, that's where the foxes, right over there, has their den. And I'm thinking, wow, this isn't going to take any time at all. We already know where they live, you know. We go down, grab us a couple, be back home before dark, you know. But he didn't move, so I didn't move. I thought he'd invited me to the dance. I'd let him lead, so we stood there. Well, after a few minutes, he pointed to a pipe, just a drain tile, laying on the ground. Not in a ditch, just laying there. He said, yeah, this is where I feed them. Excuse me? He says, yeah, get them dead roosters from the cockfights on Sunday afternoon. No, I don't go to those, preacher. No, them's illegal. But somebody gives me them dead. Yeah, that's it. Somebody gives me them dead roosters, and I know how the Lord wants us to recycle. And so I bring them back up here and put them back into ecosystem. I thought, yeah, that's what's going on here. But then I realized that's why we weren't moving. We're just going to wait till they came up for supper, grab us a couple, and then we're done. Again, it didn't seem like much of a sport to me. And then I got to thinking, how do you actually dispose of a live fox? I mean, I didn't have anything to deal with this. And I looked over, and Roy didn't seem to be any better armed than I was. And finally I said, Roy, where's your gun? He said, gun? What do we need a gun for? I said, to shoot the foxes. He said, shoot them? Law, we're not going to shoot any foxes. I said, well, what are we going to do when we catch them? He said, catch them? We're not going to catch any foxes. And I thought, we know where they live, we know where they eat, we already know we're not going to catch anything, and I just kind of blurted out, what's the point? He said, to listen, which made no sense to me. He's getting irritated. Get back in the truck. So I got in the truck. We drove on to where the woods met the field, and we drove down among the trees. Notice I didn't say around the trees. He wasn't real particular about getting the whole truck around every tree, which explained why the truck looked the way it did. So we kind of pinballed our way down through the forest, bouncing from tree to tree that kept jumping out in front of us. We got to a little clearing. There were 4 trucks already there. Backed in. He backed in. I looked around, and in a glance, I realized every man there is a member of my church. And so I thought, well, this will be good. I'll get to know these fellas. This will be a good thing for me as a pastor. Well, they let the dogs out. Worst racket I had ever heard in my, these dogs, and they go climbing all over the, well, then they got away. They got out away from us, about a quarter of a mile away. You couldn't see them anymore, but you could sure hear them. And then something happened out there. I don't know. But I could hear something happen different, and those dogs were barking differently. And one of them said, oh, listen to them sing. And I'm thinking, we're nowhere near the Baptist church for them to hear choir practice. What are they talking about? One said, oh, listen to that music. And I kept thinking, if a dogs would be quiet, we could hear the music, And then one of them said, listen, new Jim's out in front tonight. I said, new Jim? He said, yeah, that's old Jim's son, new Jim. And he's out in front tonight. And I said, how can you tell? Every man turned. And one of them said, you deaf? I said, no. They said, can't you hear? Well, yeah, I could hear. And it sounded like, to me. They began to mimic those dogs' barks. Their voice is what they call it. They mimic their voice. They could tell you from their voice who was in the front, who was in the back, who was in the middle. They could tell you if it was a red fox or a gray fox. They could tell you if it was a hot trail or a cold trail. All from the sound of these dogs' voices. Well, eventually they get so far away you can't hear anything. Do you move? No, preacher, they'll be back. Just sit still. Gentlemen, this is a great sport, okay? If your doctor says you need to get a new sport for your health, do this one, okay? Because you just sit on the tailgate of the truck. The dogs do all the work. I mean, it's a great sport. If it ever goes to the Olympics, I'm trying out because I think this is my ticket overseas. Well, but then that's the other part of to listen. You can't hear the dogs anymore, so they began to tell stories back and forth. Stories of things that had happened in the community. Stories of things that they wanted you to believe that had happened in the community. I heard Woodrow Gray tell the story that night of going to the looking off place with his granddaddy when Woodrow was 7 years old, and his granddaddy sat there on the bluff and said, "Son, when I was your age, I sat right here and I watched the Yankees move through the valley down there, up over the gap and down into the cove." I looked it up. General George H. Thomas, Army of the Cumberland, September 1863, marched through Johnson's Crook, up over Stevens Gap, down into Macklemore Cove. Braxton Bragg of the Confederacy moved out of Chattanooga, and they collided at a creek called Chickamauga and fought it out. Now, Woodrow didn't know that part. All he knew was what his granddaddy had seen and told him. I said, "Claude, I heard you know some stories." "Nope, don't know another one." This went on for about 6 months. Finally, he said, "What are you after?" And I said, "I just like to hear stories." He said, "What do you mean?" I said, "You know, the kind that you tell after supper at the dinner table or sitting at the fireplace or out on the front porch or on a fox hunt." His eyes lit up. He said, You mean lies?" I said, "Yeah, lies, that's what I want." He says, "Oh, hell, preacher, I know lots of lies." He would call me. He'd say, "You need to come visit me. I thought of another one." Well, he got very sick, got cancer. And he ended up having to move in with his brother and sister-in-law. He couldn't live by himself. He got so sick. They went to the Baptist church. There were only two churches in Plum Nelly. The Methodist church would have been there since 1840, and the Baptist church had been there since 1953 because there were some of them that got mad at their cousins in the Methodist church and just went over and started a Baptist church. So that's how they ended up with two. Well, this brother and his sister-in-law were members at the Baptist church. Well, I would go, and Miss Bradford, oh, she was so sweet. "Oh, preacher, we're so glad to have you in our home. Can I get you a cup of coffee? Can I get you a piece of cake?" And she was so nice. But then when she would kind of get us settled, she would leave and just let Claude and I visit. Well, on the first visit like that, I said, "Well, Claude, I'm going to have to go on home." And he said, "I'll walk you out." I said, No, really, it's all right. I'm fine. No, I'm going to walk you out." We got out on the front porch, and just as the screen door had hardly slapped shut when he said, "I thought of another lie." And he told me on the front porch. Well, that became the pattern of every visit. We would visit indoors, and then when I said I had to leave, he would follow me out and would tell me another story. And it finally dawned on me what he was doing is he didn't want this Baptist sister-in-law to know that he was lying to the preacher. I think he was trying to protect me. I think he didn't want her to know that I wanted to hear him. I think that was the other part. Well, he got very, very ill, and it turned out to be the last 2 weeks of his life. But he called me, and he said, "You've been so kind to me. I want to take you to lunch." Well, now, up at Plum Nelly, there was no place to eat lunch. If you were going to eat lunch anywhere, you either had to go down the mountain to Trenton, down the mountain to Lafayette, or up the mountain to Lookout Mountain Town. That's the only place to eat up our way. Well, I got over there. We started to walk out. He had to lean on me, and he handed me his car keys. I said, "Why do I need these?" He says, "I'm taking you to lunch." I said, "Claude, you're too weak to drive." He said, "I know that. You're going to drive my car." I said, "No, I'll drive my car." "No, I'm taking you to lunch. We got to go in my car for me to be taking you." Well, we argued a few minutes. He just insisted. Now, you all don't understand why I'm kind of pushing back on this, but Claude had this black Ford Fairlane with a license plate on the front of it that said, "Fox hunters do it all night." Which was not really a car I wanted to drive through the community, you know. But he insisted, so I did. I drove it, and people talked about that for months. You know, said, "Saw you in Claude's car the other day." Yeah. Well, we made it down to the blinking light. Right was to Lafayette, left was to Trenton, straight was to go on. He says, "Well, let's go on up the mountain a little bit." Oh, well, there's not much up there, but all right, it's a long way. We went a little far. He says, "Pull into Brownie's." Just a little convenience store place, had gas. Well, I glanced down. The car was full of gas. I knew we didn't need gas. He says, "Come on, let's go." We went in, and right there at the cash register, he reached down and picked up a Three Musketeers and reached over and pulled a Coke out and said, "Now, preacher, anything you want, I'm buying today." And that was the last meal I had with that man. I was sitting in the front seat of his car with a candy bar and a Coke. And he told me the last stories that he would ever tell me in his life. But you see, that's part of what happens. That's how we live. That's how we tell stories. His funeral, 2 weeks later, I talked about Jesus the storyteller. But I also told the story of Scheherazade and 1001 Arabian Nights, where this young woman begins to tell a story to stay alive. She tells a story, a new story every night to stay alive. That's part of what happens in the body of Christ. We tell stories and it stays alive. The body of Christ stays alive in those stories. They become, Christ's life is embodied in those stories and has new life. And that's how we pass faith. You don't argue somebody into the faith. You tell them stories. You think about it. Clarence Jordan called Jesus' stories Trojan horse stories. Because you see, Jesus would begin to tell a story and people's defenses go down. And then the next thing you know, it's a story about me. It's a story about you. Think about when Nathan goes to confront David, right? Does he go in and say, "David, you're wrong"? No. He goes in and says, "David, let me tell you a story." And David says, "I love stories." "Yeah, what?" And he begins to tell a story, and what happens at the end? David said, "Who is that guy?" And you can just see Nathan grin. "Why, it's you." And David doesn't argue with him. He knows that it's a story about him. You see, that's part of what we do, is we tell stories. I was asked by the Park Service to write a little booklet a number of years ago about the church buildings in the Smoky Mountains, Great Smoky Mountains National Park. There are 7 church buildings still standing that the Park Service maintains. At the time the park was created, there were actually 22 churches in the bounds of the park. One, by the way, one Episcopalian church. It was on the extreme west end, right near the Little Tennessee River. If you're going to ask a preacher to write a book about churches, you can't expect it to be about architecture, okay? So I want to know the stories of these people who had been worshiping congregations in these places in the park. They all have annual gatherings where the old families come back. So I began attending those and listening to the stories. And they all had the same pattern: worship, dinner on the grounds, and then they just sat and talked. But I noticed that each one, every year, the group slowly divided as the afternoon progressed into 2 groups: the men and the women. Well, see, I'm wanting to hear stories, so I'm going back and forth. I've got my little notebook out. I'm trying to listen as much as I can. And I have come, fellas, to a conclusion about storytelling and gender. And that is, men are much better storytellers than women. Now, there's a reason for that. It's because women are too accurate. Okay? Women seem to think facts are important. Men, not bound by that. I have a storytelling friend that says I always tell the truth, even if I have to lie to do it. And so I was listening to the men tell, and Gudger Palmer, who lived to be 101 years old, he was the only centenarian at the Great Smoky Mountains National Park's 75th anniversary. Gudger was the only 100-year-old man there. Gudger was telling a story, and he said, he says, Skeeter's the best dog I ever had. He said, that dog could hunt anything, anytime, anywhere. He said, we was haying and put the hay up in the barn, and we told everybody, don't go over in that corner of the barn. We think it's rotten through. All right, guys, I think that's the funniest thing in the whole story. I love the fact that they didn't repair it. They just said, don't go over there, okay? I mean, I don't know if you're that way, but, you know, I'm sure I've said to Janice a time or two, yeah, it'll get better. Just leave it alone, you know. But I love that about the story. They said, just avoid it. But Bill Gass couldn't stand it. He went over to that corner and did this and fell right through. Well, they pulled him out, and in the dirt underneath, clear as day, were fox footprints. One of them said, go get Skeeter. He said, why would I go get Skeeter? You said that dog could hunt anything, anytime, anywhere. He said, boys, how did these tracks get here? He said, they walked around the stone foundation of the barn 3 times. They couldn't find a hole big enough to have admitted a fox, much less, even a mouse, much less a fox. How'd this happen? They got to arguing. Well, they finally decided that fox had walked through there the night before his dad had built the barn. He said, boys, Dad built this barn 75 years ago. They said, you said anything, anytime, anywhere. He said, boys, there's no way. You said anything, anytime, anywhere. And so they got to chanting it at him, anything, anytime, anywhere. He thought, okay, I've been bragging about the dog way too much. I'll just go get it. We'll get it over with. So they put Skeeter down in there. She sniffed around, jumped up, came around to the outside, exactly to the spot where the tracks led on the inside, sniffed around, and took off. Got to running, all of a sudden jumped up in the air. They said, what's she doing that for? He said, fellas, you know good and well we had a fence that ran down through there. Said, we tore it down about 30 years ago. That fox must have been jumping over that fence. Well, he got out in a field. And he said, what? They said, what is he doing that for in the field? He said, well, we didn't cut them trees down until 25 years ago. She's having to run around all them trees, like the fox did. Skeeter got over to the cornfield, stopped, started digging with all 4 legs, dirt flying up everywhere. What's she doing that for? He said, fellas, we've been plowing that field for 15 years. She's having to put them tracks back together, see which way that fox went. Got over finally to the other side of the cornfield. They heard, They went over to the pond, little bubbles. They said, what's she doing that for? He said, fellas, we didn't build that pond till 10 years ago. She's having to run along the bottom where that fox was before all that water got in there. She came out the other side. This went on for days. She'd come back in, eat, go out, be up on the ridge, over in the valley, over by the creek, day after day after day. 3 weeks. And then nothing. Not a sound, not a sight. They looked everywhere for her. They put food out, they blew the horn, they put a picture on milk cartons, everything they could think of to find that dog. No luck. 4 months later, got a phone call. Gudger Palmer? Yes. Cataloochee, North Carolina? Yes. You have a dog named Skeeter? Yes. Well, I'm Sergeant Miller with the Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania Police Department, and we answered a break-in call last night, a used clothing store in downtown Pittsburgh, and we got there and a large plate glass window had been smashed in, and when we got in there, we found your dog with your tag and identification and phone number on it, growling at an old fox fur coat over in the corner. He thought, well, she finally tracked it down, you know. He said, now, Mr. Palmer, insurance going to cover all the damage on this end. We just want to know, do you want your dog back? He said, well, yeah, I want a dog like that back. Well, we thought that, and it'll cost about $750 to fly her down to you on Delta. He thought, boy, that's a good dog, but it ain't no $750 dog. He said, well, what about busing her down here? He said, well, we checked on that as well. Of course, you know, her being a dog, we'll have to send her Greyhound. And he said, we checked on that. It's going to cost about $200, and you'll have to go over to Asheville and pick her up. Boy, that's a lot of trouble and money. He said, reckon how much that fella wants for that fox fur coat. I said, I don't know. I have to call you back. Called him back in about 10 minutes, and he said, I checked with him. It's a used clothing store. He thinks he sold that same coat 3 times himself. So he'll sell it to you for $20. Gudger said, mail it to me. So about a week later, here came the truck. The dog was just running right there behind it, you know, and right up to the house. Again, those are just the kind of stories you hear.